Welcome everyone. On behalf of the Australian Museum and the Australian Museum Foundation, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar to help save Australia's frogs. My name's Amanda Farrer. I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Development at the Australian Museum, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm joining you today from Gadigal country, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past and present, from all the nations that you are joining us from today. Welcome to any First Nations brothers and sisters joining us, and thank you for your continued custodianship of our natural environment, the land, the skies and the waterways on which we depend for survival and well-being. Today we are delighted to have Professor Chris Helgen, the Australian Museum's Chief Scientist and the Director of the Australian Museum Research Institute, and Dr. Jodie Rowley, the Australian Museum's Amphibian and Reptile Curator, giving us a state of the nation on Australia's frogs and the critical importance of the science and research carried out by the Australian Museum Research Institute. With some housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for you to share with your friends and colleagues on the AM website. At the end of Jodie's address, there'll be a 10-minute Q&A, so please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask any questions, which I'll direct both to Jodie and to Chris. And at the end of today's webinar, we'll be calling for donations and providing you with links as to how you can make a donation into the chat function. We have over 1,000 people joining us online. Many of you are our wonderful Frog ID citizen scientists, so a very warm welcome to you. Also joining us this afternoon, we have our wonderful donors and partners and members, and we are so thankful to all of you for your continued supports, particularly in these difficult times. A warm welcome to the directors of the Australian Museum Foundation who are joining us today. The Australian Museum Foundation raises much needed funds for the Australian Museum and is driving this frog campaign. They have generously supported today's webinar and we thank you for your support. Sadly, the news that Jodie will be sharing is not a positive one. She'll be sharing details on a large-scale frog mortality event currently impacting frogs across Eastern Australia. And Jodie and her team, together with their friends and colleagues at Taronga Zoo, have received hundreds of emails through Frog ID with details of frogs that are dying or sick. The funds we raise will allow critical research and an urgent communications campaign to commence to combat this threat of Australia's frogs. To hear more about this, I want to introduce you to Professor Chris Helgen, our Chief Scientist and the Director of the Australian Museum Research Institute. Chris joined us over a year ago and is responsible for more than 80 staff, including research scientists, collection scientists and collections officers, together with associates, fellows and students who research and explore today's major challenges. Before joining the museum, Chris was the Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Adelaide. He has focused much of his research primarily on fieldwork with living animals and research in museum collections to document the richness of life, explore global change and contribute to important problems in biomedicine. Originally from Minnesota, he served as a curator in charge of mammals at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington. But Chris has been visiting the Australian Museum for over 20 years, since his student days working with Professor Tim Flannery. Over to you, Chris, to set the scene and explain the importance of your team's research.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And welcome to everybody who has joined us today. A huge number of people, thank you. I know you're here because you love frogs, because you love nature, and that you're here to learn about how that you can help. As Amanda mentioned, my role is as the director of the Museum's Research Institute, and I supervise all of the science that happens at this museum. More than 100 scientists, including Dr. Jodie Rowley, who you're going to meet next, who study the natural world and the cultural world around us, the importance of these things within Australia. We have the largest scientific collections of any institution in Australia. What that means is that not only things on display at the museum, but behind the scenes in our collections, we have really, really important scientific samples and specimens that we use to study things like frogs and other parts of nature. This is a really important reference. We also, of course, have really important platforms for citizen science, for a chance to everyone across the nation here in Australia to make contributions to studying parts of our natural world. And one of those that we're most proud of is the Australian Museum's Frog ID. This is a science project that's helping us learn more about what is happening to Australia's frogs all around the country. So as you know, many of you are contributors and users to Frog ID. It is simply a matter of recording frog calls with nothing more than your phone and contributing that information to a national initiative. And that public contribution from all of you is what is so important and makes it so powerful. So today we have more than 400,000 verified frog calls that are part of the data set of Frog ID, thanks to you and to other members of the public. The more that grows and the more calls that you contribute, the more powerful that data set becomes, and the more we can learn about where frogs are, where they aren't, and the different ways that frogs are being affected in our modern world. Now, we know that the world is changing very fast. Environments are changing very fast, and we feel that in Australia with warming temperatures, with raging bushfires, with droughts and floods. And one of the impacts that we're acutely aware of are new diseases that impact the animals and plants that call Australia home. And unfortunately, what brings us together today is an alarm call that we've been hearing that many frogs on the east coast of Australia have been dying from a disease. Now, when this starts to happen, we need to learn as much as we can, as fast as we can. And even though we might be in a COVID lockdown, like many of you, here in Sydney and other parts of Eastern Australia, our science continues. And so when we started to be getting information, and Jody's going to be talking about this, from interested members of the public saying, we're worried something's happening, that information flowed through to us and we've acted as quickly as we can. Now, when something like this happens, when a lot of frogs are dying, it creates a scientific mystery. And we immediately need to know, how can we solve it? It's a whodunit. And our lead detective on the case is Dr. Jody Rowley. And there's no better detective to jump in on this case because she is the lead scientist of Frog ID. She has her finger on the pulse Australia-wide of how frogs are doing. She is our curator of amphibian and reptile conservation biology here in the herpetology department at the museum. Herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. That's Jody, a herpetologist. And she's based at the Center for Ecosystem Science as well at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney. Now, Jody is a biologist with a focus on amphibian diversity, ecology, conservation, and a passion for communicating biodiversity conservation. And she focuses on amphibians because, like we're going to see, they have some of the greatest threat levels for any kinds of animals in Australian ecosystems. And they also have a large amount of undocumented diversity. This is a place where we know so little and can learn so much that we're still finding things like species of frogs that are new to science. Frogs do so many irreplaceable things in the ecosystems around us, and they're being lost at an unprecedented rate. Again, that's what brings us together today. Now, I'll turn you over to Jody, and she's going to be explaining in detail what's happening right now and what we need to learn about it. And then we'll come back to this afterwards with a chance for questions and answers. So Jody, I'm going to send it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to everyone for being here today. It's an absolutely, normally would be a pleasure to be speaking to you, but today it's not always some good news. But before I get into the event that is happening now, I'll give you, I guess, a bit of a snapshot of Australia's frogs and how they're doing, and a little bit more about what Frog ID is teaching us, thanks to everybody's submissions. So we're really, really lucky in Australia. We have an amazingly unique and really diverse array of frog species that call Australia home. So around 280 243 species, and they range from tiny little frogs that live mostly in the leaf litter and we hardly ever see them, to giant burrowing frogs that live in the outback that again only come out when it pours with rain, might be once a year, might be even less, to big green tree frogs that we see and we're very familiar with on our decks, outside calling as well. So they're a really huge part of Australia's diversity. Sorry, it's fiddly to change. And I guess one of the most amazing things about Australia's frogs is we actually don't yet know how many species of frog we have. So there have been several new species described in the last couple of years, and a couple of the new frogs that just popped up were described within the last 5 years. So there's species that we don't yet know exist scientifically. And so it is a really exciting time, but really strange that we still don't know how many species of frog that we have in Australia. And Australia doesn't have the greatest track record for frogs. And in fact, probably the whole world doesn't have a great track record for frogs at the moment. But in Australia, we've already lost at least 4 species of frog, at least, because several other species are missing. And this includes things like the gastric brooding frog. There was 2 species. You can see it pictured here in a jar at the Australian Museum. This frog is no longer in the wild. You and I will never get to see it unless you're one of the lucky people that might have seen it some time ago. It's completely disappeared. We only have photos, audio recordings, and a few precious specimens in museums around Australia, including the Australian Museum. And we don't want that to happen again. Unfortunately, there are 36 species of frog in Australia that are threatened with extinction, which is a huge proportion of the frog species that we do have. And an alarming 15 of these are considered critically endangered, which means that if they're still around, they are holding on at the very edge of extinction, which is absolutely awful. And the reasons for frogs disappearing are varied. Unfortunately, it is sort of death by 1,000 cuts. Frogs are very sensitive and threatened by a huge array of things, from habitat modification, introduced species, climate change, and one thing that really, I guess, would be the focus of this talk and deserves really special attention is disease. And one disease that deserves particular attention is called chytridiomycosis. And it's caused by a type of fungus, the amphibian chytrid fungus, Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. It was first discovered in dead and dying frogs in Australia in the 90s. And it was a huge detective story to try and figure out what was going on at that time. So frogs were disappearing around the world, including particularly Eastern Australia, and nobody could really figure out why. So scientists, very much as we are now, were desperately trying to figure out what was going on. And so it wasn't until later that it was discovered. And now we know that it's been present in Australia since at least the 1970s. And unfortunately is very widespread. So it's basically everywhere, particularly along the East Coast. No documented reports from the Northern Territory though, but we're not too sure. So unfortunately it is over a lot of Australia. And it has driven the extinction of hundreds of species of frog around the world, but is the primary driver of the extinction of the frogs that we know of that have gone extinct in Australia. And it is an ongoing threat to Australia's frogs, including all of those threatened species that we talked about. It invades the skin of frogs, which is like their Achilles heel. So frogs drink through their skin, they in part breathe through their skin. And so when something really disrupts the way their skin works, then it can have and has had serious consequences. But I guess I'm going to get a little more serious in that why should we care? Now, I think probably if you're here today, you do care, and you care because frogs are amazing and you fall in love with them like I have. But there are some more maybe important or universal reasons why we really need to care about frogs. So the first one is that there's a lot of frogs, or at least there should be in healthy ecosystems. And in many ecosystems, frogs make up the highest vertebrate biomass. So if you were to make kind of an imaginary pile of all the mammals, imaginary pile of all the birds, reptiles, and frogs, in many ecosystems, the frog pile would be the biggest. So even though each individual frog is small, together they make up an enormous part of healthy ecosystems. And then it's obvious that when they start to disappear, then it's going to have some really widespread consequences. Frogs also typically have an aquatic larval stage, tadpoles. So they form this amazing connection between freshwater and terrestrial habitats. Frogs lay their eggs in the water, so that's a transfer of energy. The tadpoles then develop in there eating algae, and then they metamorphose and move on to land, so converting sort of this energy in a cycle back from freshwater to terrestrial ecosystems. And they're a really important part of food webs. So adult frogs eat literally tons of invertebrates, including pest species, and they also make up a large proportion of the diet, a lot of mammals, birds, and reptiles. Plus, tadpoles are primary consumers of algae in streams and aquatic ecosystems. So unfortunately, we know what happens when frogs disappear, or at least really get reduced from ecosystems from places where they have, like Central America. And from there, we know that it has long-term lasting consequences. The streams aren't ever the same again. They clog up with algae. All of the other animals that rely on frogs for food disappear as well. And even after well over a decade, no other animal steps up to fill the role of frogs. We need them. Now, there are a few more selfish reasons that we want frogs around as well. So, for example, mosquitoes actually compete with tadpoles. So tadpoles in the sort of a healthy ecosystem will help keep mozzie populations down, which is fantastic. And frogs are also essentially kind of bouncing agar plates, and they do get infected by a lot of things, and they do have a lot of compounds on their skin that protect them, antivirals, antifungal, antibacterial, and these kind of even adhesives, like you can see in this holy cross frog, and the sort of goo on its back. So frog goo could actually help save us as well, humanity. And every time we lose a species, we lose that chemical cocktail, these antimicrobial peptides that frogs have on their skin. Frogs are also very sensitive, most species, very sensitive to any kind of environmental change. So by tuning into frogs, by monitoring frogs, by using Frog ID and things like that, we're actually getting a really good understanding of ecosystem health more broadly. And at the Australian Museum Research Institute, we're tackling frog conservation on a lot of fronts. So we're working to understand how many species of frog we have in Australia, trying to understand the threats of disease, of habitat change, and try and mitigate those threats as well, or recommend conservation actions. We're searching for missing species like the peppered tree frog that hasn't been seen since the 1970s on the northern tablelands of New South Wales, and also missing populations like the northern tablelands tusk frog. And we're working to get these into management priorities and actions. And in the last 4 years or so, many other people across Australia have joined the Australian Museum Research Institute via citizen science. So they've joined our fight to get the information that we need to save Australia's frogs. And it's been absolutely remarkable. So thank you to all those people out there. And you know that all Frog ID relies on is a phone that most of you have in your pocket and use, and the fact that every frog species in Australia calls and has a unique call. So just by recording the frog love songs, you've done an absolutely amazing job of, in fact, you've revolutionized our understanding of frogs in Australia. So in under 4 years, you've contributed over, at the moment, 404,000 frog records, which is incredible, of 204 of Australia's frog species. And more than 23,000 of you have actually contributed an audio file. Many more have actually downloaded the app and have registered as well, which is amazing, but we desperately need more recordings as well. And this is so remarkable because what the Frog ID database now represents is more than 75% of all other frog records in Australia, collected over the sort of last 200 and or so years. We now have, in less than 4 years, more than 75%, which is absolutely amazing. And all these are geo-referenced and have an audio file associated with them. So this has been an incredible game changer. Frog ID also shows no sign of slowing down. So particularly every summer period, we get a lot of frog calls coming in, and we're hoping that that continues, especially now we have this new crisis on our hand. Frog ID is teaching us a lot, and you can check out more on the Frog ID science page on the website. But Frog ID, and thanks to everyone out there, has taught us that some frogs are disappearing. So the green tree frog, which will be the focus, unfortunately, a bit of this talk, has disappeared from much of Sydney, where it was formerly common. And we sort of thought that this was probably occurring, but it wasn't until everyone out there recorded a lot of frogs around Sydney, but not a lot of green tree frogs, that we actually realised this indeed, we confirmed that this was the case. We're getting amazing records of threatened species, including tiny little threatened species that call in the middle of winter, like Sloane's froglet. So we're able to get a great understanding of where threatened species are, what habitat requirements they have, and when their breeding seasons are. And unfortunately, Frog ID data, although I guess it wasn't initially, we didn't think it would be so important in some of these crises that have been happening, particularly in Eastern Australia, but it's been vital in understanding the impacts of drought and impacts of fire, particularly the devastating 2019 and 20 bushfires along East Coast Australia. In good news, it was Frog ID users, it was everybody out there recording frogs immediately after the fire, because of course myself and most other frog biologists were in lockdown. That revealed some good news. It revealed widespread persistence in many of Australia's frog species after fire, which was fantastic because we were absolutely terrified of the implications. Of course, we don't know the long-term implications, and continued recordings, as well as some of the surveys, the scientific surveys we've been doing, are really going to help with this. It's also helping us understand the impact of land use change. So we found that about 70% of species that we've examined using the Frog ID data are actually intolerant of habitat modification, thanks to all your recordings. And we're tracking invasive species such as the cane toads and helping, I guess, confirm that there's no more invasive species of frogs out there. And we're also helping inform new species discovery. So those frogs that you might be recording with a slightly strange accent, maybe they are just a scientifically undescribed species. So we're on the job. And unfortunately, we believe that Frog ID will be actually really, really vital in helping understand the impacts of this frog die-off, this mass mortality event in frogs that we're witnessing right now. It's not what we intended that Frog ID would be, I guess, used for, but it's going to prove really vital. Now, before I get going, I just want to warn everyone, there's some really upsetting images and statements coming up. And I'm also going to be honest with you, is that because they've really affected me. I've been getting a lot of emails from people, which I really, really appreciated, but it's awfully, awfully upsetting to see what's going on. And I just can't imagine how upsetting it is for all the people out there that are actually witnessing this. I'm only getting reports and photographs, but my heart goes out to you. This is absolutely awful. So I'll start at the start. So in June, I had a couple of reports that I saw on Facebook and social media of some green tree frogs dying just north of Sydney. And I was concerned because no one ever wants to see a sick or dying frog. But often the beginning of winter, that kind of first cold snap, is when you see any kind of frog mortality. So frogs' immune systems decrease as it gets colder. And so if they're a little bit sick or even old, that's when you might see, or you expect to see, some mortality at that sort of first cold snap. And so I guess I was a little bit worried, but it wasn't until a few weeks later I got a call from someone saying, look, I've got some more frogs. So I did a radio interview, and then ABC wrote a sort of a local report saying that frogs around Scott's Head in northern New South Wales were actually being affected. And I asked people, could they please report? Anyone that has noticed sick or dying frogs, please report them to me. We need to understand desperately what's going on. And then the emails started coming in. And they were from a greater area than just in northern New South Wales. And so I teamed up with my colleague, Dr. Carrie Rose from the Australian Registry of Wildlife Health, and wrote an article in The Conversation, which was then shared by ABC, and it got a huge amount of sharing. And what that revealed to me was that the scale of this event was something that certainly I've never seen before. I think someone is controlling my slides. Okay. So something that we've never seen before. And the people were reporting these absolutely horrifying things to me. So some quotes from people that were wonderful to email me. So out in midwinter, in broad daylight, they've all been quite lethargic and have eventually died where first found. Their skin has been a strange dark color, almost black. Another email. I noticed 4 green tree frogs in the daytime looking very lethargic and discolored in our garden. Within 24 hours, I have discovered each to be deceased. Another, most unusual behavior was a large discolored frog walking around in the middle of the day, large discolored frogs walking around in the middle of the day on the road and on walking trails. And there's some horrifying photos of beautiful green tree frogs. Normally, they're starting to turn a sort of a brown color. And essentially for sick frogs, and this is largely for green tree frogs, what we're seeing is that the frogs are out in the daytime. So this is winter, they should be typically hiding away, and they're coming out, they're sitting in exposed places where people are seeing them. They're slow moving or lethargic. Their skin is usually patchy, so it's lighter or even darker than normal. And it's often kind of a reddish brown on the back, and they have sort of pink or red on the belly, and patchy sort of peely skin, which is really, really awful. In terms of dead frogs, people are observing, particularly green tree frogs, but a whole bunch of other species as well, that their skin is often darker than normal and they're really shriveled. And of course, this can happen really rapidly because frogs do tend to kind of shrivel up and disappear, which is one of the reasons it is so alarming that we're seeing so many reports of dead frogs, because it is quite rare to see a dead frog. They decompose really rapidly. So the fact that we're seeing so many now is incredibly alarming. So where were people reporting these dead frogs? So initially we heard of northern New South Wales, and after the call went out more broadly, we've seen a pretty alarming pattern. So it seems that we're getting a lot of reports from North Queensland all the way down into Victoria. There's a single record in Tasmania. In fact, you can see that New Zealand is also represented here, and that's an Australian native frog in New Zealand that was reported with similar symptoms, so a green and golden bell frog. A handful of reports around the Perth area, and that's the motorbike frog around there. A few reports in the NT and South Australia, but it's potentially that there are just some sort of normal dead frogs being observed. What we're most alarmed by is this sort of southeast Queensland and particularly New South Wales. So about 70% of all of the reports of sick and dying frogs, native frogs, are from New South Wales. It's absolutely horrifying. I mean, this is a lot of dead frogs, and this is just what I've reported, and we're getting lots and lots of reports every day. About 60% of these frogs are green tree frogs that are being reported, but we don't know if that's because they're the frogs that people tend to see more. We don't know what's happening to the frogs that are out in the swamps and in the forests. It might be a case of, you know, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Because they might be dying without anybody seeing them. And further evidence of that is that so far we've had 26 native species reported sick and dying. After green tree frogs, the order of the frequency of reports are cane toads, Perrins tree frogs, like this one here from Sydney, striped marsh frogs, and eastern banjo frogs. So a big question, the huge, burning, urgent question is what is happening? And so I am not a veterinary pathologist. And so I teamed up with someone that is, so Dr. Carrie Rose at Taronga at the Australian Registry of Wildlife Health. And I'm working with her to try and many other state government, conservation and biosecurity agencies to try and get to the bottom of this. But what could it be? Well, the number one suspect is, of course, chytridiomycosis. So that's the disease that affects frogs' skin, whether it's maybe a new strain or whether it's some other environmental stresses that have really kicked this off. There were a lot of frogs, really good breeding seasons over spring and summer. It was a wet summer followed by a cold winter. So maybe there's some interaction there, but it could be a host of other things that will all be investigated, from bacterias to single-celled parasites, combination of ecological disturbance, toxins, perhaps most terrifyingly, a new or exotic pathogen, some kind of new disease that's affecting frogs. It's potentially a combination of several of those. And so it's going to be a big job to try and figure out what it is. And this is urgent. This is urgent from two reasons. One is that we need to know what is happening so that we can recommend action. And we desperately want our frogs to stop dying. And two is because we very much hope that the frogs will stop dying soon, particularly as the weather gets warmer. And if we don't have a good understanding of frogs and what's happening now, so frogs in vets and tests done on them, we're not actually going to potentially ever figure out what is happening. And so this is what we need you to do. We need you to keep watch for sick or dead frogs. If you have frogs in your backyard, if you've got somewhere where they normally hang out, check on them. Spread the word as well. Sick frogs really need to go to vets, and we can help you find the vet that is aware of what's going on and how to treat it. They can die very, very quickly. From seeing them in the morning, they can be dead by nightfall. Please report any sick and dead frogs to Frog ID via our email. And in New South Wales, we really want any dead frogs that you find to be frozen so that we can then test them later so that their death cannot be in vain. Hopefully it can help us understand what is going on. It's very important to follow hygiene and biosecurity protocols though. So we recommend wearing a pair of disposable gloves or turning a bag inside out before grabbing the frog and washing your hands to avoid any potential spread of disease. And the biggest frightening question to me, regardless of the cause, is what impact is this going to have on Australia's frogs? Are all these frogs going to change the game in terms of conservation? Are we going to see as many frogs out and calling in spring and summer as we hope to? And I guess the takeaway is that we just don't know yet. We don't know what's causing it. We don't know what impact it's going to have. But thanks to some of the feedback, some of the horrifying feedback from people across Eastern Australia in particular, I have a very strong fear that this has the potential to change things forever for frogs. And they've affected me deeply, and I'm warning you that these statements that people have emailed in will probably affect you deeply. But I'd like to share them with you because I think they give us a horrifying but potentially true understanding of the impact that this event is going to have on Australia's frogs. Firstly, I've been finding a couple of dead frogs every day since winter started. I've always had around 30 of them that come in each night during summer, and now they're all dead. Not just the green frogs, but other small species too. I've spoken to a lot of neighbours and friends in the area, and they're all reporting the same thing. We've been living here for 26 years and have never seen this before. And the massive colony of green tree frogs here in my ponds and yard have all died literally at once. And there were some very old frogs that I've seen every year for so long now. At least 30 adults and many little guys are all dead. And lastly, I would sadly like to report a great loss in our green tree frog population. We've lived here for 36 years. The green tree frogs come into our kitchen every night. In summer or any warm evening, we can have anywhere from 3 to 20. The last couple of weeks, I've found dead frogs on my veranda, as well as in my house, inside cupboards, and on my sink. It is so sad to see them sick and dying. Breaks our hearts. We can only hope that some can survive through this outbreak and one day recover. Goosebumps. So this is a potentially really awful event, but we need to get to the bottom of it together. We need to figure out what's causing it. We need to conduct targeted scientific surveys, and we need everybody to be using Frog ID, because only together can we figure out, I do not know what is happening. I am not doing this. Okay, we're only together we can figure out what is going on, and only together we can work to save Australia's frogs. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, well, sobering news from Jody. Thank you, Jody, and to you, Chris. We are so privileged to have these two exceptional scientists working here at the Australian Museum. I also want to acknowledge that Kim McKay, our Director and CEO, has recently joined the webinar. She was taking part in an important panel discussion with ANSTO, representing the museum's work. Thank you, Kim, for your leadership and support. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask any questions. We've already got quite a number, and I'm going to get through as many as I can. And Nadia is also going to try and answer some. I'm not live. Some of them have all got similar themes. And let's kick it off. Can I ask Chris, why is it so important that the museum conducts this research in collaboration with the Taronga Zoo?
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks for starting us off. And Jody, thank you for that presentation. How sad these statements and these pictures are at the end. We're going to chat about this together and paint the picture of how urgent the situation is, how sad and how urgent. Now, Amanda, you've asked about how important it is that we work together between the Australian Museum and Taronga Zoo to solve this mystery as fast as we can. And that's because we have these experiences and expertises that complement each other at these two great institutions. At the Australian Museum, our bread and butter is understanding the variety in the natural world, biodiversity in all of its glory. So we have the experts like Jody who are here to understand everything we can about frogs, how many kinds there are, where they live. And we have that expertise in-house, and it's bolstered by our collections, and it's bolstered by Frog ID. So we are the place that is studying and has our finger on the pulse of how frogs are doing, and thanks to so much help from all of you. So we have the biodiversity science, the samples, the laboratories that help us investigate these questions. But the zoo has expertise, especially in veterinary medicine. It has experience with working with live animals and understanding their threats and their disease. So we need to tackle it together. Carrie Rose and Jody Rowley are the two people who are on the case, as I've mentioned. And when these events have emerged before, and this is not the first time we've seen a desperately terrible, sad wildlife disease take hold across a large area very fast. This has happened with chytrid fungus, as we learned about. It's happened in other things that I've seen all over the world. White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that wiped out many bats from where I come from in the United States. Devil facial tumor disease has wiped out so many Tasmanian devils. The point here is when these things emerge and scientists start to understand them with help from the public, we need to get on top of that understanding as fast as possible. What is causing this disease? What can we learn about it that can help us stop it? So it's by working with veterinarians and biodiversity scientists that we can figure that out. And the last thing I'll mention about that is, I used to be based at the Smithsonian in Washington, DC. When chytrid fungus had emerged as something that a fungal disease was wiping out frogs all over the world, it took scientists a while to figure out, what is it? which fungus exactly is causing this problem, why, how does it work, and how do we protect frogs from it? And it was work between the museum and the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Again, that partnership between veterinary and biodiversity science that helped crack the case on this one, on that one. Now we need to crack the case on this one, and it's so important we work together. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Chris. Now we've got a question from Sharon. How long does a frog, with this, I'm assuming this is the citrus fungus, but how long does a frog have the fungus in its system before it starts showing symptoms? And how does the virus spread from frog to frog?
Good question. So the amphibian chytrid fungus, it has these sort of aquatic like life stages that are like almost little tadpoles. And so they're in the water and the soil. A frog might say sit in the water and they'll swim. They can actually, they're motile, so they can move towards where they can kind of sense the keratin in the frog's skin that they eat. So they come and they burrow into the skin. So a frog can actually kind of be okay with a light infection. So most of this, if most of their skin is fine, then they'll just sort of, I guess, suffer a little bit, but not too much. And they can actually cure themselves. So it's a fungus which actually hates it when it's very hot and very dry. So frogs might have it for a little bit and then do a bit of sun basking in the middle of summer, and then they could actually cure themselves. So being infected doesn't necessarily mean a frog is going to die, which is good. Each species of frog is different in how tolerant it is. It depends a bit on its behavior, and it depends a bit on the chemicals, and sort of antimicrobial chemicals and other bacteria and things on the frog's skin. So it's very difficult to know how long it's going to take. These frogs that are succumbing at the moment, they might have had a light infection a few months ago and something's happened, if this is indeed what is causing it. Again, we don't know that this is actually the amphibian chytrid fungus. And it could just really ramp up for some reason and cause them to decline. Certainly from when they sort of show signs that they're not well, it seems that whatever's happening now, it can be less than a day from looking kind of not that great to dead, which is horrifying. And it's horrifying. So that's one of the reasons that frogs really need to go to the vet, because they really do need veterinary care if they're sick. It's the amphibian chytrid fungus is transmitted from frog to frog. So if they touch each other, it's in the water, it's in the soil, and it can kind of just be around, which is one of the biggest problems. And one of the reasons that this disease has caused the extinction of so many frogs. So it doesn't sort of, in the wild, normally it gets to a stage where there's not enough frogs around anymore, so the disease disappears, and then the frogs can kind of come back if they can. But because it's always in the environment, it's always around, it's in the streams, the lakes, everywhere, the frogs are always dealing with it, and that's why it's having such a huge impact on frogs sort of on a day-to-day basis, which is really awful.
Jody, can I clarify a question that people are asking about that too? The chytrid fungus, like you say, can just be around in the environment, but it also has moved with, people have moved it around the world. Isn't that the case as well?
Yes,
that's how it's spread as a threat.
So we believe, for a long time it wasn't known, but we believe that it was introduced from Asia, spread around the world accidentally. And so certainly we've known that it's in Australia from at least the 1970s, but before that we believe it wasn't here, which is why our frogs have no kind of tolerance. They haven't evolved with this disease, and so it was something new to them, and that's why it's caused such serious issues. Unfortunately, now it's kind of considered endemic in Australia, which means that it's an ongoing thing. We can't really get rid of it. And so all of our efforts are try to make frogs better able to cope with it. And there's also some exciting news in that some species that disappeared are now becoming a little bit more resistant. So if we can keep giving frogs the help they need, then we might be able to help them get over this. Of course, we don't know what is going on now though, and this is going to be a much bigger hump for them to get over.
That's a good point. We've seen things like chytrid take off in this way in the past, but we don't know if that's what's causing this current one.
Jody, what are your thoughts on whether or not the bushfires, this is a delayed response to bushfires and all the ash and the mass change in environment since the bushfires in 2020?
It's a good question. Certainly that was a stressor for sure, and not just the bushfires, but also the drought. And so there's been sort of a cumulative sort of stressing event. So it is possible potentially that this is certainly contributing to what's going on. It's weakened the frog's immune system somehow and made them more susceptible. And we will be exploring that and every possibility that we can think of. But the scale all the way from North Queensland to Tasmania, and also sort of including perhaps a bit of Southwest WA, I'm not sure that it would necessarily explain it all, but we're on the case.
Thanks, Jody. Now, I know Chris and Jody, can you just explain that who we've been seeking funding from the government? And I know that you've also been speaking with the Threatened Species Commission, and we've got quite a number of questions on how the government is interacting with us on this. And I'll talk a little bit later about how much we need to start this work, but what the government's doing to assist.
I guess we've been working alongside and keeping informed state and federal government, particularly, lots of meetings. It's a rapidly evolving situation, and it's kind of escalated from something that nobody knew was happening to something, thanks to all these reports, to something that we think is potentially really devastating. So it's kind of a gaming process now. We're just desperately trying to respond, and hopefully we will be able to get the support we need to be able to find out what's causing this and what we need to do going forward, and also understand what impact this is going to have.
I'd follow up on that and just say that absolutely we are keeping everyone informed, and we're reaching out to federal and state partners for the support that is going to be needed here. And there is a really important role for state and federal government in helping us to get on top of understanding what's happening. But there's also a really important role for every member of the public, potentially. Again, that's why we're coming here to talk to you today. Many of you have been part of Frog ID. Some of you for years now, contributing really valuable information that forms this baseline for understanding, our understanding, Jody's understanding of what's happening with frogs. Now we're actually knocking on the door. We're coming to you today and saying, we are actually in a crisis. Until now, we knew that frogs are having a lot of challenges, and we're collecting this data because we know it's going to be useful for when we really need it. Well, now we're coming across a moment where you, as citizen scientists, have told us there is something terrible happening. Jody is on the case, but we are just starting to scramble and put our boots on and get out the door and try to understand it. So we need your help. Keep those Frog ID calls coming in, but support us. And when you can, there's information there for how to make a donation. So federal, state government, everybody, you at home, we need your help.
Thanks, Chris. So there's a number of questions around using Frog ID. Is it important that we keep recording the same areas from time to time and submit those calls?
Yes. So I guess what we're trying to do with Frog ID is so varied. And so we want recordings from as many places as possible, but we also do want repeat recordings over time. And so a lot of people tell me, oh, you don't need, the good old Fred in the backyard that calls every night. Actually, yeah, we do, because we want to understand when frogs are calling, and that will also help us understand things like the impact of climate change. Are frogs calling at different times of year? Are frogs calling less? And so, yeah, every day from a site, if you can possibly do it, and as much as you can, essentially, taking 10 recordings from one spot's obviously not going to give us a lot more information unless a new frog starts calling, but regular recordings from the same place are invaluable.
I think you're muted there, Amanda. We can't hear you.
Sorry, right, can you hear me now? Thank you. There's lots of questions. We're going to keep asking them. I just want to give a sense to everybody of, on top of the government grants, we're collectively trying to raise $250,000 to carry out the research and field studies over the next 10 months. And we need about $100,000 to pay for some specialised freight cost to get the frog specimens that are in freezers all over Australia back to the AM and Taronga Zoo to commence this research. So Jody, just explaining what sort of the next steps are and how any fundraising will be used would be really helpful, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges we face is lockdown actually at the moment as well. So I can't get out there into the field. I can't look for frogs myself. And so what we've got is I've already got well over 100 frogs in freezers across New South Wales. And we desperately need to try and get them for toxicology testing, which New South Wales the EPA is going to be able to do for us. We desperately need to get them for testing for disease. We need to do as many tests for as many different things as possible, obviously including the amphibian chytrid fungus, and that involves some DNA work at the Australian Museum, some tests very similar to the COVID test, but for chytrid for frogs, and the Australian Registry of Wildlife Health needs to do a whole bunch of additional tests, looking at slides, trying to figure this out. So it's going to be a really comprehensive kind of trying to figure out what's going on, but we can't do it without the frogs to us. And because they're frozen and they can't thaw out, we need specialized transport, almost like medical transport, to do that. So that's our first, most desperate thing, is to try and get the frogs to us. And this has been going on for weeks, but we've got very few samples available to us because it's so hard to get them to us.
Okay, all right. Okay, everyone can hear me? Sorry, I'm having problems with my mute button. Okay, so we're going to put some links up to where you can get extra information. So there's a whole lot of detailed information about what to do if you find a dead or dying frog, including how to and how to contact the Frog ID team so that we can record these what's happening with frogs around you. It'll take you to the Australian Museum Foundation Save Our Frogs campaign. Any donations that you make, which are really desperately needed, over $2 are tax deductible and you'll receive a receipt. We'll also be sending everyone that's joined today an email with links to how to donate and ask any further questions. We'd also love if you want to put in the chat now a pledge. If you'd like to leave your name and the amount you'd like to pledge. Giving begets giving, and we'd like to see that the 1,000 people that are here today all collectively make a great impact by kicking off this research with some donations. I'd also like to really thank my team, Claudia, Adele and Jackie, who together with Nadia and the Frog ID team have put today's webinar together. It was only a week ago that we sat down with Jody and she told us about this frog crisis. And I'm so proud of how we've worked together, gathering all of you today. And thank you all for joining us to save Australia's frogs. We are really appreciating everybody's support and that it's so wonderful, particularly for Jody, to feel this sort of collective around her helping and being able to, this is critical work and critical information that you're providing, as Chris pointed out. That sort of ends our webinar today. We want to stay in touch. Have a great weekend. Don't forget to grab your phones and download the Frog ID app and head into your backyards and local bush settings. Record frogs over the coming weeks and months, particularly as we head into Frog ID week in November and the springtime. Thank you again. Very grateful for your support. Is there any final words from Chris or Jody?
Just a huge thank you to everyone for being here, for everyone supporting this. I really do believe that we can make a difference together, and everyone's already been so amazing. I would be in a pool of tears on the ground right now if it wasn't for the inspiration I get for the fact that how much people care as well, that, you know, that we're not in this alone, we're all in this together. Thank you so much.
And to close, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for being here today, for supporting Frog ID, for making the pledges that you are making right now. You've heard from Dr. Jody, the frogs really need your help, and we need your help right now. So thank you for being part of the Frog ID community and for doing everything you can.
I'm going to just stay on and thank a few of you that have started to make those pledges. To Joanne, who's pledged $20 and wants to download the app and get out there. Charlie Cook, $50. Thank you so much, Charlie. I'd like to thank Jan Menzies for her $20 pledge. Marg Borton has pledged $250. Thank you so much, Marg. We've also got a pledge, I'm just opening up, from Emma James. Thank you so much, Emma, $100. And from Gail Molson, $100. This is amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. We've also got Chris Hayward has pledged $100. Thank you, Chris. $50 from, who is this? I just, yeah, name not coming up. Thank you, Deborah Martin, for $100. It was really wonderful. Thank you so much. This is Jessica Hagan. Thank you, $200 pledge. Evelyn, thank you so much for your $50 pledge. I'll hopefully get through all of you. Thank you. We've got Graham Dunk, $100. We'll be sending you links on how to make that pledge, and you can see it in the chat as well. I think, Adele, if we could put the link to make that donation, that's wonderful. Really appreciate all of your donations. Thank you, Monica Moore, $50. Julie Ottaway, $200. Who have we got here? Joanne, $50. Jane Munro, $500. Thank you, Jane. How wonderful. You're very generous. And $50 from Suzanne Hopkins. $100 from Kathy McDonald. Thank you. And lovely messages of support for Jody as well, and Chris and all of the team. Thank you so much. Hilary Thomas, $100. Margaret Goldfish, $200. Judith Essex Clark, $50. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. This is just wonderful, and all adds up. And there's more coming in. $100 from Harrison Golson, thank you. And Davidson, thank you, your $100. Kirsty Lambert has pledged $100, wonderful. $20 from Leanne Calthorpe, $50 from Claire Peng, thank you so much. $100 from Stephen Davies, wonderful. We've got $200 from Dr. Sentelpath. Sorry if I've announced that incorrectly. Shannon Greenfields, $50. Brian Richardson, $100. Wonderful. This is so good, everyone. Andrew Cole, $50. Gemma Quick, $50. We'll keep putting the website, the link up in the chat. Ella, who's aged 9, has given $50. Thank you so much, Ella. What a wonderful, wonderful frog friend you are, and we really appreciate your support. It's wonderful to see families and their children getting behind this. Paula Castillo, $50, and Tricia Packham, $25. Really wonderful. We will also be making sure that we've got a couple of you going, are we doing a running tab? It's rushing in, the money's rushing in so quickly that we're not keeping hold of the tab, but we will make sure that we let you know when we send out the link to donate, and the wrap up of today, what the final outcome was, and keep you updated with other fundraising that we'll be doing around this. Claire Peng, $50. Jay Azindo, $50, and also get his partner to pledge another $50. So that's $100. Well done. Cecilia Rubinas, $100. Julia Langford, $50. Thank you from all the fellow frog lovers from the mid-north coast. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Lots of thank yous to Jody and the team for all their work. Sam Henry, $100. And thank you, everyone. You're all really valued stakeholders in our Frog ID. So this has not gone out to the general public. It's just our citizen scientists, our Frog ID citizen scientists, our donors and our partners, and particularly our members. All of you are like making such a difference, and we really appreciate the love for our frogs and our work at this time. We've got $75 from Rowan and Cartry Melanin, $50. Thank you so much. $30 from Ren McLean. Thank you everyone for your generous donations. I know Jody and the team are so thankful. We have Trevor Wintle, $100. Thank you so much. We've got $200 from Wendy Henderson. Thanks so much, Wendy. Lynn Churchill. Sorry, Wendy Henderson, $2,000. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Wendy. How wonderful. That's very generous, and you know, that's, yeah, really excited for your donation, very generous. Lynn Churchill, $50. Christopher Gira, $600. Wonderful, thank you so much, Christopher. Many thanks for organising the event. We've got David Dyke, who's pledged $100. Thank you. Thank you. And then, yeah, so I'm trying to keep up, but it's coming in thick and fast. Wonderful. So Claire Peng, $1,000, all my money. Thank you so much, Claire. That's wonderful. Adele Moore is donating $50. Thank you for the webinar. And thank you very much to Anna, who's been online already and donated $100 to the campaign. Fabulous, thank you. It's wonderful to pledge, but it's really good to just carry out that final bit where you go online and actually make the donation. And yeah, thank you, Claire, $1,000, wonderful. Lydia McKenzie, thank you so much. Christine Johnson, happy to donate $100 to this cause. We'll be sharing with family and friends on Facebook and Instagram to spread the word. Thanks for all your hard work. Wonderful. We'd love if more people like Christine shared the link to make a donation and to share the information about the appeal to Chris on their social media, because that's great to get it out. You know, part of our campaign is to just improve the communication, so get to as many people as we possibly can about this this event and how you can all help. It's, you know, wonderful to be able to do these things together, even though we can't see each other and we're in lockdown. So yeah. I can really feel the humanity in the room today. Thank you, Claire Peng, for your $1,000. Brian Hartzer, our chair of our Australian Museum Foundation, has made a $500 donation. How wonderful. Thank you. $100 from Colette, who's getting online right now, and thank you for caring for our frogs, is her lovely message. Nikki Lang has said, thank you so much for your wonderful work and heartfelt concern. You can hear Jodie's passion for the work that she does. She's such a wonderful colleague to work with, as is Chris Helgen. We're really lucky to have these amazing people that really care about our biodiversity and understanding it so that we can ensure that it thrives. Thank you, David Turner, who's just donated $100, and Nikki Reeves, who's about to go online and donate $30. Well done. We have Lee, who has donated $250. Thank you so much. I'm just opening up the names here. Yeah, that's Lee. I've got a lovely message from Jill or Gillian. Thank you, and stay strong, Jodie. We'll spread the word of Frog ID, and for people to keep their eyes open for frogs. Yeah, and they have also donated to the link. Thank you so much. We've got a great note of support for you, Claire, who had donated $1,000. Thank you, from Joanne. Yeah, starting to feel the love in the room as people are starting to congratulate others that have made wonderful pledges. Everything is, Kieran Gunning, who's only 9 years old, is putting in $10. So thank you. I'm sure that was hard-earned pocket money and it will be really well spent, Kieran. So thank you so much. A pledge of $100 from David Flack. Thank you, David. That's really wonderful. And Carol Race has just donated $50. We're going to wrap up now, but thank you so much for everybody that has been, putting pledges into the chat today, has taken part. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't read everybody's name out, but we're just so thrilled for the support, and which will be put into really good use. We, again, don't forget to get online and make that donation through the web link that's in the chat here at the bottom. It's the www.australian.museum/frog-appeal. Thanks again so much.